We tend to think of behavior, both moral and non-moral, in terms of ought. What should I do? What ought I do? If I want to be a really good soccer player, I ought to practice. If I want to be a good person, I ought to do. When we're talking about moral behavior, these oughts can get really tricky and sometimes even contradictory. But Immanuel Kant thought that he found the perfect system for making sure that we avoid contradictions in what we ought to do in terms of morality. He called it the categorical imperative. Kant believed that there are no ifs in moral behavior, only oughts. It's not a matter of if I want to do something or if I want something I ought to do, but rather I simply ought to do something because I have an obligation to do it. I have an obligation to be a moral person. And this obligation stems from reason. Kant believed that we are all rational beings and are therefore bound to morality via reason. And since there are no contradictions in reason, there can be no contradictions in morality. Kant believed that the categorical imperative was a system that could ensure that there would be no contradictions in our moral behavior. And because of this, the categorical imperative is both binding and absolute. By categorical, he simply means that there are no exceptions to it. It is independent of our goals, and it is absolutely good in itself. It's based in reason, and so the categorical imperative avoids contradictions. The best way that I've learned to think about the categorical imperative is to visualize it as an assembly line in a factory. You input raw materials, and they go through the assembly line, and at the end, you have a finished product. There are checkpoints along the line to ensure quality, and if the product doesn't meet certain standards, it gets kicked out. In our moral factory, maxims are the raw material. Maxims are simply rules that one follows, and they take the form, when I am in circumstances C, I am to do X. These rules govern our behavior, but in order to determine whether they are moral, they need to be put through the categorical imperative. So maxims go in, and hopefully we get a moral command at the end. But first, these commands need to pass the checkpoints, which are called formulations. So our first checkpoint, or our first formulation of the categorical imperative, is called the law of universalizability. And it says, act only in accordance with that maxim that you can will, without contradiction, to become a universal law of nature. So only do those maxims that you could will everyone to do, and it still be reasonable. This is an important test because it ensures that you're not only holding yourself to the same standard that everybody else is held to, but it also makes sure that you're still being rational. Take lying, for example. If our maxim is, when I want to gain an advantage, I am to lie, we'll have some trouble with the first formulation, because if everyone lied in this situation, there would be no advantage in lying, so the maxim would be irrational. First, we have to establish if it's even rational or possible to universalize the maxim, and if it is, we have to ask then, would we want that to be the case? If we find that it's not possible or rational to universalize this maxim, or that we find that we wouldn't want it to be the case if it was universalized, it doesn't pass the first formulation of the categorical imperative, and our maxim gets kicked out and is considered an immoral action. If it does pass the first formulation, then it doesn't get kicked out. It moves on to the next one. The second formulation of the categorical imperative is called the humanity principle, and it says, always act in such a way as to treat people, oneself and others, as an end in themselves, and never as a mere means. Kant believed that as rational creatures, we have an intrinsic dignity that cannot be taken from us. For this reason, we always have to respect the agency of ourselves and others. This requires us to treat people as ends in themselves and never merely or simply as a means to our own goals. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't use people as a means to our goals. We do this all the time when we go out to eat or come to class and gain knowledge from a professor. We use people in our basic interactions. But what this does mean is that we can't use people merely as a means, meaning that we must always give consideration to their rational agency. If our maxim fails to ensure that this happens, it violates the second formulation of the categorical imperative. If it fails the second formulation or the humanity principle, we again have to kick out our maxim. It's immoral and we can't do it. But if it passes, we can move on to the third formulation. This is called the formula of autonomy. And it says, act as though through your will you could become a legislator of universal laws. This formulation tests the moral value of the action you are considering. Kant wants you to imagine that the action you are about to take will become a universal law without exception. And this seems very similar to the first formulation, but it deals less in the rational aspect and more in the moral value of it. Would you want to live in a society where this is the case? If the answer is no, once again, the maxim gets kicked out of the system. But if the answer is yes, it passes the third formulation, and you now have a good moral action that you have an obligation or a requirement to always do without exception. While Kant was quite sure that the categorical imperative would be the ideal moral system, there seemed to be one glaring problem, which can be seen in the murder at the door situation. It's a hypothetical situation which says that a murderer is at the door looking for your friend. The question is it morally right to lie to the murderer and say your friend is not around, or to tell the truth and say that your friend is upstairs, knowing that it would cause harm to your friend? Our gut instinct is to say that the right thing to do would be to lie to the murderer and save your friend. But Kant actually responded to this scenario and said that it would be wrong to lie to the murderer because it violates the second formulation or the humanity principle of the categorical imperative. The murderer has an intrinsic dignity that must be respected at all times. Lying to him doesn't allow him to exercise his rational agency and is therefore a violation of the second formulation. Further, Kant says that predicting consequences is too difficult and could lead to contradictions, which is why Kantian morality is always exceptionless and doesn't use consequences of an action as the basis of its moral rightness or wrongness.